Good morning, art historians. Good afternoon, art historians, depending on where you are. My name is Allison Napier, and I am here to get you through the last review of the week. Welcome to our session, TGIF. Today, we're going to look at works that incorporate everyday objects. So let me get started with that and share my screen with you. There we go. And so I call this one lecture Toilets, Teacups, and Tin Cans, and this focus on the object as art. So we're going to talk about artworks that use or incorporate everyday objects as their subject matter, media, and materials. And first of all, as far as the skills go, and that's the skill slide, I'm going to maybe kind of bypass that today, see how it goes, and maybe we'll just talk a little bit about what we're going to do. So the skill we were supposed to cover today is 6B, which is attribution. We made a schedule before we'd seen too much about what was going on with the AP Art History exam. So while attribution won't be necessarily evaluated, a direct question on attribution on the exam, the use of visual analysis skills and being able to discuss context and traditions and changes, which will be on the AP exam, is something that we can focus on even in kind of couching it in this idea of attribution. So we're going to start with, I'm going to show you a couple works like I always do by different artists. And as we work through, we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the use of formal elements and, like I said, visual analysis, and then maybe work our way into kind of some skills that, might be a little bit more applicable to the things you need to do on the exam. So we get started. As we consider the use of the everyday object in 20th century works of art, it's important to remember that we have several works prior to this time that depict common objects: flowers, plaster casts, goldfish bowls. Those are in the image set, and we're going to address those in here as well. But we're going to focus on how the use of everyday objects from mass culture, popular culture, commercial culture are used in art movements that, in a way, to challenge ideas about art and art institutions in major ways. And in particular, we're talking about Dada, Surrealism, and pop art. As the mass population became more and more a consumer society, especially in the wake of the Second World War, but this really begins with industrialization in the late 19th century, the everyday object changed, and it turned into a signifier of both class and status in some ways, and it also served to create an equality of living conditions in others. So people began to buy and consume things as we became more of a production-based society. So we're going to start with Dada, which was a, a movement that pretty much generates out of the aftermath of World War I. And there was a very high death toll in that war. It was also the first war that was not kind of a gentleman's war, where we were fighting on horseback with swords. It was trench warfare. It was not that warfare is ever not nasty and gritty and cruel, but in particular, we had a lot of soldiers that came back from this war with shell shock, and the Dadaists really wanted to overthrow this society as far as its norms and its authority and its, of this bourgeois society. They felt it kind of gotten us into this problem in the first place in the 1914 start. So they want to cultivate absurdity, they want to denounce, they want to shock, they want to awaken the imagination, challenge bourgeois taste and logic. And so this art movement of the avant-garde develops really around 1916 in Zurich. It spreads to Berlin, and it's again born out of this negative reaction to the horrors of World War I. It rejects reason, logic, prizes nonsense, irrationality, intuition, and the act of choosing. That's actually the art act, right? The act of creation is the choice of objects for many of these Dadaists, and chance is also something else that's really prized here. So the word Dada coming from, there's several different myths about where it comes from. It's the French word for hobby horse. It's also said that when I went to an exhibit on Dada at the MoMA, they said that they looked up the word in several different dictionaries and it had a different meaning in each language. There's also theories that it comes from artists Tristan Tzara and Marcel Duchamp's frequent use of the words da, from Romanian that meant yes, yes. So where Dada and its name comes from, in flux and in question, or a lot of different possible mythologies, but it's an important movement that lays influence, that will be influential on surrealism and pop art, which will come down the road. From our image set, we have this work, Fountain, probably one of the most famous Dada works, widely seen as an icon of 20th century art, created by Marcel Duchamp. Now, the original was lost, and it basically consisted of a standard urinal, which, guys, most of you should recognize this, right? Usually presented on its back for exhibition purposes rather than upright. So Duchamp has taken this urinal, which he bought clean, sanitary from the factory, and he changes its orientation, which in essence for him changes the meaning and purpose of this object. He then signs and dates it R. Mutt 1917. And so this is what he calls a ready-made, an ordinary manufactured object that is designated by the artist as a work of art. And that's very typical of this kind of Dada aesthetic and sentiment. Duchamp was a French-American painter, sculptor, chess player, and writer, whose work is also associated with Cubism in the early days, Dada, and conceptual art overall. He's commonly regarded, along with Picasso and Henri Matisse, as one of the three artists who helped define the revolutionary developments in the plastic arts in the opening decades of the 20th century. And by World War I, he had rejected many of his fellow artists like Matisse as retinal art, basically art intended to please the eye. He wanted art to serve the mind. So he seeks an alternative to representing objects in paint. He begins to present objects as art themselves. So he takes mass-produced, commercially available, often utilitarian objects, designates them as art, and gives them the title of his choosing, usually with a little bit of a sense of humor to it, like the fountain for urinal, and ready-mades are what he calls them. And he disrupts centuries of thinking about the artist's role as a skilled creator of original handmade objects. He argued that an ordinary object could be elevated to the dignity of a work of art by the mere choice of the artist. So the ready-made defies the notion of what is art, what is beautiful, and the idea that art must be beautiful. And so by claiming that, everyday objects can be art, he creates a reaction or kind of a pushback against visual indifference and this idea of good and bad taste. Two other works that he creates, Bicycle Wheel in 1913, according to Duchamp, I had the idea to fasten a bicycle wheel to a kitchen stool and watch it turn. The result, Bicycle Wheel, is the first of Duchamp's ready-made objects, sometimes manufactured again or mass-produced. In this case, he called this one an assisted ready-made because he actually combined two utilitarian objects to form one work of art. On the right, you see In Advance of a Broken Arm. And so he takes a snow shovel, hangs it from the ceiling of a studio, and calls it art. This is a mass-produced functional object, and it challenges the accepted assumptions and traditions that art should reflect an artist's skill, and it must be handcrafted by the artist himself. Like so many of his ready-mades, he really brings this idea of what is the role of the artist to the forefront. So Duchamp, always assigning these funny titles to his ready-mades. In Advance of a Broken Arm refers playfully to the function of a snow shovel. Basically, you remove the snow from the ground so you don't slip, fall, and break your arm. Duchamp recalled that the idea for Fountain arose from a discussion with collector Walter Ahrensberg and the artist Joseph Stella in New York. He purchased the urinal from a sanitary ware supplier and submitted it as a work by R. Mutt to a newly established society of independent artists that he helped to found and promote these ideas of the avant-garde. The Society's board of directors, who were bound by a constitution written for the organization to accept all members' submissions, took exception to Fountain, believing that a piece of sanitary ware, a toilet essentially, right, was not and should not be considered a work of art. Furthermore, it was indecent and probably shouldn't be displayed around women. Ahrensberg and Duchamp resigned from this group in protest and effectively see them as trying to censor the work of an artist. So the fountain, according to the board of directors, said it may be a very useful object in its place, but its place is not in an art exhibition, and it is by no definition a work of art. Now, this image right here, I want to show you how basically, for those of you that are, I guess, urinal orientation challenged, this you see Duchamp taking, this is how he orients it for the fountain exhibit, but you can see that this is not how it would functionally work if it was actually in action. So the creation and submission of fountain is this experiment of Duchamp to test the commitment of this new society that he was a part of this new artistic society, to freedom of expression and tolerance. Duchamp was not publicly known as the creator of fountain at the time, although some of his closest friends like Ahrensberg knew and others suspected. Duchamp later explained he had not made his identity known because of his position on the Society's board of directors, and he felt that if the other board members knew that he had submitted the work, their response might have been different, and he really wanted to kind of challenge them and see how they responded. Several photographs were taken of the work in 1918. They show it also hanging, well, they showed it at the show, but they also in 1918, these images will show it in the doorway of his studio. What happens next, we don't know. It might have been thrown out when Duchamp went to Buenos Aires in 1918. But somehow it's gotten lost, potentially destroyed. And basically, it wasn't commented on again until the 1930s, when the Surrealist movement and poet André Breton started kind of digging around and was interested in Duchamp's work of ready-mades and kind of how it reflected Surrealist values. And so as Duchamp's profile begins to take hold again, he begins to get some attention, especially later down the road in the 50s and 60s. There's a whole new generation of artists interested in this object or in this work, I guess. And so he has a number of requests to create replicas, and which he authorizes. So he authorized replicas of fountain in both 1950 and in 1963. He signs each of these replicas with Marcel Duchamp, 1964, on the back with on the left flange. There's also a copper-plated element at the base of each of these, which we can't see from our image in the set, as well as signs that, of course, are mud with the black paint. So what I show you now is a tale of two toilets, as I call it. Take a minute and think about both of these works, right? They're everyday objects. How do they demonstrate a change from the traditional subject matter and materials of art? I guess kind of up into the points in which they are created. Why are we making toilets is the question. And how are they different in their use of the everyday object? So take a few minutes and then I'll kind of touch base. So as you look at these images, one of the things you need to think about is what is the difference between choosing to create a sculpture of a mass-produced object like we see on the left and using a mass-produced object as a sculpture itself? And these are questions that we can kind of work our way through as we go through our presentation today. You don't have Doho Su in the image set, but he creates his work and believes in working with construction of spaces from his life and elements that were held within spaces in different media. So he's using new media, resin, styrofoam, fabric, wire. to kind of create this see-through rendition of the toilet. So the subject matter, of course, both a urinal and a standard toilet that we recognize from today's culture, both deemed inappropriate, generally not considered the subject of high art. They are both mass-produced objects, although one is a sculpture of the object itself. So we have a choice of a ready-made versus a choice of creating a sculpture of an object that's a popular culture object, a practical object, a utilitarian object. I'm not sure exactly how we label toilet in that way. I guess it's kind of all of those. And what you see here is the artist Doho Su showing using this and creates a whole actual mesh bathroom as well to kind of make references to his home in this kind of overt way as well as a covert way. And he uses this sculpture to help explore identities and how we respond to our surroundings. So while Duchamp is challenging art itself, the contemporary artist Doho Su is taking his toilet and really working with personal experiences and how we respond to our lives. As we move into Surrealism, we talk about a cultural movement started in 1917, best known for visual artworks and the juxtaposition of uncommon imagery. So we're talking about unnerving, illogical scenes, sometimes photographic precision, unexpected elements, non sequiturs. Works of Surrealism always tend to feature an element of surprise. And the Surrealists believe that their dreams occurred on a level at which all human consciousness was connected, and they were very interested in the work of Sigmund Freud and the idea of the id and the unconscious and subconscious. And they also believe that dreams allowed people to construct forces or allowed them to move beyond constructing the forces that constructed their own personal environments. They could re-engage with deeper parts of themselves and the parts of themselves often that they suppressed when they were awake. So this surrealism means under realism. How this all comes about is World War I scatters a lot of artists who have been based in Paris in the interim, and they got involved in Dada, and then they continue to evolve these ideas, especially once the analysis work of Freud begins to kind of merge. They're all embracing idiosyncrasy, rejecting any sort of idea of an underlying logic, looking for more for the underlying madness of things. So some Dadaists literally and very naturally transition to surrealism. This idea of exposing psychological truth, stripping ordinary objects of their normal significance, which is very similar to what we saw with the ready-made, creating compelling images that move beyond formal organization and evoked some sort of empathy or emotion from the viewer. Our surrealist work in our image set is this one, right? It makes me go like this and lick my teeth just thinking about putting this to my lips. Meret Oppenheim's fur-lined teacup, probably the single most notorious surrealist object, with a very subtle perversity that was inspired by a conversation between Oppenheim, Pablo Picasso, and the photographer Dora Maar at a Paris cafe. And so Picasso, as they're sitting there is admiring one of Oppenheim's bracelets, which was covered in fur. And he said, I think you could probably cover anything in fur. And she said, yes, even this cup and saucer. And so in the 1930s, a lot of surrealist artists are arranging found objects in bizarre combinations. And Oppenheim, who becomes involved with the group, she buys a tea and a cup and saucer set at a Paris department store, lines it with the pelt of a Chinese gazelle, and puts it into this exhibit of the surrealist works. The work highlights the specificities of sensual pleasure. Fur delights the touch, but it repels the tongue. And the cup and the spoon, of course, are objects which you have to put to your mouth. So the fur-lined tea set makes a concretely real, a very extreme and bizarre improbability. And so the tension that this creates, the excitement caused by this object, cause a lot of people to be enraged, disgusted, and or laugh at this absurdity. Oppenheim herself began working with the surrealists in the 1930s, and she liked the idea that she could confound, amuse, shock, and annoy the viewers. She was a talented and attractive femme fatale, and she became muse to Man Ray. She embarked on a passionate love affair with Max Ernst, impressed André Breton with her realization of surrealist ideas, and basically becomes most famous for this object or breakfast in fur, which wins her instant celebrity and becomes this quintessential surrealist item or artwork. The focus on desires and underlying motivations is really a key theme in surrealism, and again, very influenced by Freudian psychoanalysis, which attempts to understand the process of the id, the ego, and the superego. Desires are repressed by our entry into society, and they can be manifested artistically via cathartic expression. And this appears to be the case with Object by Oppenheim. So civilization here meets wild animal, and this idea that it may be connected to, or this idea that Breton refers to it as breakfast in fur, refers to this erotic novel of the time called Venus in Fur, which added some other overtones to the work, which Oppenheim says she didn't really intend, but nonetheless embraced the multiple meanings. Here's two other works by Oppenheim that combine and repurpose everyday objects. On the left, My Nurse, a pair of women's high-heeled shoes are tied together like game fowl, and then you have the paper frills or crowns on the heels, and they're placed sole to sole up on the platter. And while the sexual references in Object are subtle, this kicks it up a notch. Dinner is served, and it's a pair of white high heels, sole up on a silver platter, the whiteness reflecting some sort of purity, but the scuffed soles reflecting a sort of dirty under element. So the reflection here bouncing back on us as we look at the object, we are reflected in the silver tray, giving us this kind of bizarre cannibalistic ritual. It has elements of the Dada ready-made as well, the taking and repurposing of these objects. On the right, you see Squirrel, which is one of an edition of 100 of these were made. And so we see this from 1969, a later work by Oppenheim, where she takes again everyday objects and puts them in these paradoxical juxtapositions where we're dealing with rational and subverting the rational and dealing with revealing the unconscious. So Squirrel represents and kind of frustrates the viewers in the same way that Object does. The idea that we can't drink the beer out of the stein, the fluffy tail gets in the way, there's this weird foam on the top, the pelt, we don't want it to touch our mouth or our tongue. We've got this mock liquid that we can't access. All of this very frustrating for the viewer, and again, subverting our expectations using the everyday. Oppenheim was not the only artist to bring everyday things into unlikely alliance in the 1930s and later. She says art has to do with spirit, not with decoration, and a work as small and economical as Object was not outsized because of fur, had such outsized spirit because of its fur. The teacup, again, mixed with the fur, giving us these very mixed messages. It's soft, it's also very firm, it's highly tactile, so it's attractive to the touch, but only depending on what it is touched with. Both Dada and Surrealism set the groundwork for pop art in the 1960s here in the United States. It actually begins in the 50s in Britain, and it begins as a revolt, another rebellion, right? We have the Dadaists rebelling against bourgeois society. We have the Surrealists rebelling against rational, conscious thinking, and we now have pop art rebelling against culture and traditional views of what art should be. Young artists felt that they were taught at art school, what they were seeing in museums didn't really touch their lives very much. And you've got to remember, this is a period of abstract expressionism, chromatic expressionism, and what they were seeing around them were things like Hollywood movies, advertising, product packaging, pop music, comic imagery. And so they began to use these as their subject matters. Pop art is popular, meaning designed for a mass audience. It's transient, usually a short-term solution, expendable, sometimes easily forgotten. It tends to be lower in cost, mass-produced. It's aimed at the youth. It's witty, it's sexy, it's gimmicky, it's glamorous, and modernist critics are horrified. They are not used to this idea of low subject matter, and by their apparently critical treatment of it, it really flies in the face of all expectations of what art should be. It also causes issues with this boundary that's been established between high culture and low culture. And what does it mean that when we cross the line like this and choose to paint soup cans or Coke bottles? So pop art encompasses a wide variety of work with very different attitudes and postures, but they all seem to embrace this post-World War II manufacturing and media boom that happens, right? So after World War II, all of our industry that we had set up for wartime production gets retooled for consumer production. And the GIs come home and they're getting loans, and people are buying cars, and they're buying refrigerators, and they're buying mass-produced products to put in these refrigerators or in their pantries to cook on their new stoves. And so the objects themselves sort of give them a sense of not only identity, but also a sense of status. You made it, right? You can buy that can of Campbell's soup. Branding becomes very important. And no one is more cognizant of branding and products than this guy, Andy Warhol, an American artist who explores the relationship between artistic expression, advertising, and celebrity culture that flourishes in the 1960s. He's born and raised in Pittsburgh, a poor kid from the wrong side of the tracks in many ways. His work initially pursuing a career as a commercial illustrator. He does window design and shoe catalogs in New York City, and he exhibits his work in several galleries in the 1950s, and he gets a lot of acclaim and recognition. And primarily, he's known for this kind of stuff, right? He changes the concept of art appreciation entirely by taking an everyday object like a Campbell's soup can and reproducing it. He chooses mechanical derivatives of a commercially produced, mechanically produced product. And so his variations of the multiple soup cans, here we see 32 different cans of soup. This is all the soups that Campbell was producing at the time, all the flavors they were producing. So he's not interested in creating a retinal image, which would make Duchamp happy. He's interested in this idea of the repetition of the process and the technique. So the representation was more important than that which is represented for Warhol. And his interest in machine-like creation during his early pop days are really misunderstood by the art world, whose value system is very threatened by this idea of mechanically producing artworks. Warhol, when asked why he chose to do soup cans, he said, "I used to have the same lunch every day for 20 years, I guess. It's the same thing over and over again." So he gives us this kind of idea of the comforting repetition of soup. We can depend on it. The same Campbell's soup I buy in Virginia, John can buy in California, you can buy wherever you are, and it's all consistent and good and dependable. Duchamp's attitude about this, based on the statement he made about Warhol in 1964, was pop art is a return to conceptual painting, which has been virtually abandoned except by the surrealists in favor of retinal painting. If you take a Campbell's soup can and repeat it 50 times, you are not interested in the retinal image. What interests you is the concept that wants to put 50 soup cans on canvas. And so this is really what Warhol's responding to, this absolute lack of objects that we get from abstract expressionism and chromatic expressionism. And we don't have any Jackson Pollock in our image set, but we do have Helen Frankenthaler's The Bay. So this idea of the very painterly, just a complete different philosophy and technique that we see with Abex and post-painterly abstraction, we get this very different feeling from Warhol, who's looking to bring the object back to art. He wants to give people something that they can understand, something they can wrap their minds around, even though he's also working at another kind of level of conceptual art by doing this, but not on the level that you have to have some sort of elevated art education to understand, Pollock's paint drips or Frankenthaler's sense of washy color. Now, contrasting Warhol's use of everyday objects against Ruysch's fruit and insects, Daguerre's still life, and Matisse's goldfish bowl, the mundane Campbell's soup cans gave the art world a complete chill. The art world was used to seeing everyday objects, but when we look at these, we see Ruysch really focusing on the ability to capture texture and light and shadow. Her father, who was a botanist, had taught her all about different flora and fauna, and she's really developing that in the still life we see here. We took a look at Daguerre using his plaster casts in everyday objects, trying to work out the daguerreotype process, trying to figure out exactly how does light reflect off of these, what does reflect light, how long does it take for these images to develop. And then we have Matisse working with the emotion, the expressive power of color with his goldfish bowl. So they were working with a lot of maybe more formal elements and qualities in some ways that the art world was very comfortable with, even though sometimes they were a little bit hesitant to embrace fauvism and Matisse's kind of exaggerated use of color. This is what the art world was comfortable with. So this completely turned them upside down. Things like the green Coca-Cola bottles created the same year as our soup cans. And then the Brillo boxes also, he's using this repetitive imagery. He's using silk screening processes that are very common to commercial product production. All of this very important and certainly not considered what the art world thought of as high art. The work from our image set is the Maryland diptych, and it's made of 2 silver canvases. The artist has silk screened a photograph of Marilyn Monroe 50 times. What we see is basically he's taken this image of Marilyn from a film still from about 10 years earlier. Monroe had just recently passed away, and he takes this from the film Niagara and he basically appropriates it and flattens it out, adds this garish color, as well as makes a black and white silk screen. Silk screen is a printing technique where a mesh screen is used to transfer ink onto a surface, and the areas where you don't want the ink to go through are blocked off by a stencil. Use a blade or a squeegee to push the ink through. You need multiple screens. Each screen has a different color, so you have many passes, with the ink across the surface. While we may think of Marilyn Monroe as a person, you're like, well, she's not an everyday object. Think about her face and her body being used to sell magazines, movies, and other products. So that does make her a commodity of sorts. She was kind of bought and sold, packaged, and consumed by the American public. She was a well-known face of celebrity. Everybody knew who she was. Kind of think of her as maybe a modern day Kardashian of sorts. Warhol once noted that repeated exposure to an image makes us desensitized to it. And in that case, by repeating her face, this mask-like face that he creates from this film still, he drains away her life and deadens our emotional response to her. We get desensitized. We don't remember that she's a person. We think of her as a symbol. We don't feel pity for her. We think of her as somebody who is there to entertain us and there to fill our time with kind of more glamorous exposure to life as we know it. So what we see here is this large scale work. It's 6 feet by 9 feet that kind of commands our attention when we stand in front of it. We have the image of Marilyn distributed all over the surface. Some drips and drops there every once in a while, maybe speaking a little bit to the Abex, but he's certainly no Pollock. The repetitions creating the sense of identity, as we see her over and over again in multiple colors. The screens, again, manufactured the colors chosen, and you have a very rote mechanical painting technique being executed here. Kusama's a little bit of an outlier of sorts in this. I don't think of her really as a purely pop artist. I think of her as more of a performance artist, particularly a contemporary artist. She certainly has aspects of feminism, minimalism, art brut, and pop art in her work. She comes to New York in 1958. She becomes part of an avant-garde group in the avant-garde scene throughout the 60s, especially in the pop art movement. So she knows the pop artists, she's familiar with them. She embraces the hippie counterculture of the 1960s. She organizes a series of happenings, and you know Kusama because she's a fan of the dot. She's a big proponent of polka dot. She says a polka dot has the form of the sun, which is a symbol of energy of the whole world and our living life, and also the form of the moon, which is calm. Polka dots are a way to infinity. She thinks of herself as one dot among the many. She also has some mental health issues, and so when she was young, she used to apply dots or put dots on things to make sure that they actually existed. She lives by choice in Sewa Mental Hospital and says that art has become a way for her to express her mental disease. Today, there are very few female artists who are more visible to a wide range of international audiences. And as we look at her work, we start with the work from the image set. The pinnacle of her success, really, at the 33rd Biennale, Venice Biennale in 1966, is the Narcissus Garden. Kusama was not officially invited to exhibit, according to her autobiography, but she received the moral and financial support of a patron and the permission of the chairman of the Biennale Committee to stage a 1,500 mass-produced plastic silver globes on the outside lawn of the Italian Pavilion. And so this thing has been installed several different locations over time. When we talk about the Biennale, you can see it here on the grass. She takes these plastic balls and she arranges them very tightly, and this creates a reflective field for the artists, the visitors, the architecture. She puts on a gold kimono to draw attention to herself, and they look very similar to what you think of as a fortune teller's ball. And so she basically stands outside and begins to sell these things for $2 a piece. So she takes a mass-produced object, makes a work of art, and then begins to sell these to the audience, which the Biennale quickly put a stop to because they said she was peddling out there, and that's not why she was allowed to exhibit. So we have an interactive performance that's eye-catching with the gold and the silver. And so the original installation of Narcissus Garden is frequently interpreted as both not only Kusama's self-promotion, but her protest of the commercialization of art. As I mentioned, it's been installed in several different locations. It's been recreated, and over time, the meaning has somewhat shifted. So we talk about it becoming a notion of political cynicism, social critique, this idea of being able to see yourself in the ball, reflecting on you, reflecting on art, this idea that these now come with pretty hefty price tags. They sure aren't $2 a piece. And so have also become trophies of prestige and self-importance. So being seduced by your own reflective image on the convex surface, you as the viewer can snap photographs with your smartphone, and then you disseminate those images, and you become kind of beholden to those images that you capture and spread. More recently, one of the things that Kusama's done that has traveled the US, I know it was in Atlanta, it was in California. I saw this in the Hirshhorn, or her Infinity Rooms, where she has all of these gorgeous mirrored installation rooms covered with dots that you can go in and interact inside. You can take pictures. Well, you could not at the Hirshhorn because someone was taking a selfie and broke one of the bazillion-dollar pumpkins, and so they wouldn't let you take any pictures there. But our friendly co-host John Gunnan got to take some pictures when he saw this in California. And for Kusama, the polka dot says, she says, we obliterate our nature and our bodies with polka dots, and that makes us become part of the unity of our environments. So these were, a fantastic opportunity. If you ever get to see one of these, I highly recommend it. And finally, Claes Oldenburg, an American sculptor known for his use of everyday objects, taking them and blowing them up into huge scales as public art installations. You see him on the right with his wife, Kuja van Bruggen, who died in 2009. And Oldenburg is associated with the pop art movement. He says, because my work is naturally non-meaningful, the meaning found in it will remain doubtful and inconsistent, which is the way it should be. All I care about is that, like any startling piece of nature, it should be capable of stimulating meaning. So we see him here in his studio. He moves to New York in 1953, and his early shows feature objects assembled with images, paper mache, and plaster. In 1961, he stages his most famous happening, The Store, in which he rents space amid actual shops in the East Side. He sells traditional store goods in plaster sculptures. He begins to incorporate large monumental soft sculptures made out of vinyl and inflatable materials as well. And these works, sagging with gravity, kind of humorously evoke ideas of the human body. They force the viewer to kind of confront these objects. You can't get away from this ice cream cone or this pair of pants. They're just too big, right? And so you have to kind of contemplate these everyday objects in a whole new way. The work from our image set, lipstick ascending on caterpillar tracks, as Oldenburg begins to design imaginary outdoor monuments, most of which are never realized, this one was. So his inflatable lipstick ascending being the most notable exception of some of his designs. And it's a monumental tube of lipstick sprouting from a military vehicle that appeared uninvited on Yale's campus amidst 1969 Vietnam protests that the students were holding. And the sculpture was actually commissioned by the students of Yale. So while the sculpture seems playful, maybe an elaborate artistic joke, it was also deeply critical. And so this 24-foot sculpture, in collaboration with the architecture students at Yale, where he attended, shows up in Beneke Plaza, and it overlooks both the office of Yale's president and a prominent World War I memorial. And so they claim a visible space for their anti-war movement and poke fun at this, the seriousness of the plaza itself. The sculpture serves as a stage and a backdrop for several subsequent student protests, and it was never meant to be permanent. As you can see, we had the vinyl tip of the lipstick would inflate and deflate, and the balloon mechanism didn't always work, so it wasn't consistently inflating. And so the original remained there about 10 months, and then Oldenburg removed it and he created a version in steel. So here you see the permanent version that's there on the Yale campus today. And so based on his work, we see this, again, large scale monument placed in sight using a lipstick, right, which is an everyday object, a mass produced object, as well as the military vehicle. Now, Oldenburg's other works, we get things, again, these large scale images of spoons and cherries and shuttlecocks and bowling pins that he creates depending on who's commissioning him in different sites. We have the flying pins, probably the most recent work from 2000 on this screen. He's done more recent works than this. The city of Eindhoven had been rebuilt after it was heavily bombed in World War II. This is installed near the museum campus, and basically the idea was to show the aftermath of the bowling ball hitting the pins as the pins fly upward and outward and downward, emphasizing the ball and the two pins partially buried in the ground. So this idea of a sense of motion here, the spoon bridge on the upper left, located at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. Reaching for this, the subject that included fountain elements because of the water there. The cherry is aligned with the long axis of the garden. Allée, dramatically attracting visitors with this deep red hue. And in the winter, when it snows, it looks like a sundae. And then finally, the shuttlecocks, which they're kind of near and dear to my heart. The AP art reading used to be in Kansas City for art history. And so a lot of us, some of your teachers, have seen these shuttlecocks up close and personal when we've attended to do the scoring there. This was installed in 1991, and they were trying to transform this vast lawn and kind of play with this neoclassical facade. Maybe remember we talked about neoclassicism a couple days ago. And when Oldenburg and his wife Kuja went to the museum, she was really impressed with some of the feather headdresses that were in the museum. And so she started thinking about the shuttlecock form, the ball with the feathers attached, their ability to float, spin, and fly. And so they make these huge, you can see a small human scale down here, shuttlecocks, and literally put them all over the lawn. It looks like giants have been playing badminton and just kind of left their shuttlecocks laying there. And it, of course, caused great controversy, but now is very embraced by the Kansas City art community. So things to think about based on what we've looked at today, that while the Dadaists are pushing back against bourgeois values and attitudes at the wake of World War I, and the Surrealists are striving to give material form to the subconscious and the unconscious and create art with this kind of lens of Freudian psychology, and pop art seeking to challenge artistic traditions and assert the power of the consumer object, all of these groups are using the everyday object in very important ways, sometimes playful, sometimes deviant, and sometimes even a little disturbing. So each of these movements use everyday objects to promote their own views and ideas and their aesthetics, this act of choice, the revelation of dreams and desires, and the vehicle for the human experience, all being encapsulated in their works. The elevation of the everyday or consumer object to a form of high art challenged the notions of what art is and should be, and the definition of what art is and isn't has radically expanded over the 20th century and into the 21st, but this debate still rages today. So new media materials, like using neon and different commercial media, all of these things coming out of these movements, the repurposing of common objects to critique society and issues of immigration, colonialism, gender inequality, environmental injustice, so much more. All of these kind of the legacy of pop art and Dada and Surrealism. This debate, like I said, continues today. We see it with arguments over is street art. We talk about Jeff Koons and his use of large balloon animals. Is that art? And I think that these are great conversations to have and to think about as you continue to study and move through art and art history, and you're exposed to art hopefully for the rest of your life as lifelong art learners. Now, before we leave, let's not forget to review our question that John left us with yesterday, and then I'll leave you with a question for Monday. And so he wanted us to compare two landscape paintings or two depictions of the landscape, the Cézanne on the left, and then on the right, Bruegel's Hunters in the Snow from 1565, which is oil on wood. And so with Cézanne, the painting process is loose, it's not hidden, while Bruegel is showing us basically the painting process, cultivating an illusion in all the detail. Brushstrokes are refined versus the spontaneous work we see with Cézanne that's very loose. The view is loose, even though it's even in the distance or up in the foreground where we should see a little bit more solidity of form, all very loose applications of paint. Versus Bruegel on the right, even in the distance, very sharply focused and defined image. This idea of a view of form, the underlying geometry of nature that we get with Cézanne versus this diversity of village life, each of them focusing on two very different approaches, with this formalist approach to breaking down substance and material, and the communication and focus on what does that substance and material mean and how does it create a whole village. So we see an observed scene on the left with Cézanne, and then a completely invented scene on the right with Bruegel. Before you leave today, I'm going to leave you with this question. So on the screen, these are two contemporary works. These are works John and I didn't get to in our last week's material, but they are nonetheless pretty important. And I think you need to consider them based in the bigger conversation of what we've talked about today. So how do these works demonstrate continuity and change, which we know is something you've got to discuss on the AP exam? And I want you to think about how does it reflect continuity and change in the use of the commercial object, the everyday object, in creating art. And you've got a lot you can work with here. Piscopolo Afe on the one side, and then of course, electronic superhighway on the right. So we've covered a lot today. Thanks for showing up and hanging out with me to cover some, like I said, teacups, tin cans, and toilets. One more thing before I go, I want to show you this. I guess I'll stop share. I want to show you this guy right here. These were put out in honor of the 50th anniversary of his soup can painting. So yet again, another commodity. Warhol designing these, he did a lot of work with soup cans other than the ones we just saw today. So you could have bought these a couple years ago. They came in a couple different colors. I only have 2 hands, so I can only hold up those 2, but I have them all. Anyway, so before we leave, let me make sure that we show you this. If you're having technical difficulties, don't forget to get in touch with us and let us know at cb.org/tech. Thanks a lot. Have a great weekend and stay healthy, art historians. And eat your soup.